Okay, good morning everyone. Happy Friday. It's a little bit rainy out there. It's a little bit gray, but that's okay. Um, I see Ivan's here. Ivan, you beat me here. Good evening to you. Jimmy, good morning. Casey, good morning. Justin's here. Good morning, Justin. Good morning, Jenna. Karen's here. Hello, Karen. And hello, Mashid. Okay, I'm a little tired this morning. I'm not sure why, um, but that's okay. The coffee will activate and then we'll be fine. Erica's here. Hello, Erica. Caleb's here. Good morning, Caleb. Good morning, Monica. Um, so, like I mentioned yesterday and the day before, we'll do our quiz on Monday. Don't forget. I think it'll be classes 29 to 39. So, it'll be all about the sexism stuff we've been talking about for the past couple weeks or so. Um, so 29 to 39, I will put it in Microsoft Teams, just so you know. But I had a look, and I think that's okay. So class 29 to 39, that's what we'll do the quiz on, and we'll do that on Monday. Okay, so let's jump in. Yesterday we watched this video on BBC documentary on what stands in the way of women being equal to men. And we talked to 4 young women around the world who expressed some of their ideas about what their experience was like as young women in their societies, and what kind of ideas and experiences they were having in terms of keeping them from being equal to men, I suppose. And so the first question, the messages we heard about boys and girls and men and women, um, I think we heard a number of different things. From Vigdis from Iceland. Good morning, Manish. From Vigdis in Iceland, I think we heard from her that one of the things that stood out for me anyway was when when they were making breakfast. They were at home with her entire family, and they were making breakfast, and they were talking to her dad and her brother, I think. And one of the things that they said that I think was important and we might have missed yesterday was the idea that, traditionally speaking, women's responsibilities have been in the home, right? So they've been responsible for taking care of the home, for cooking meals, for cleaning, for taking care of the children, kind of everything that happens in the domestic sphere, in the sort of the area of the home. That's kind of what women were responsible for, and men were responsible for sort of going out into the world, right? So men had jobs outside the house doing whatever. Men were responsible for earning money, earning a living, bringing that home to the family and providing for the family, right? So traditionally speaking, we had these very clearly defined gender roles in terms of who does what. And of course, in many places of the world, we still have a reasonably clear divide between those two genders. But what Vigdis points out, and I think is probably, good morning, Thika, or good evening, Thika. What Vigdis points out, and I think is probably accurate for a lot of modern countries, is that now women have moved into that other sphere, right? Women have gone out into the world, they have jobs and careers, they earn money. Sometimes they earn more money than men do. Statistically speaking, not so much, but we'll deal with that. Um, and so they're out there in the world earning a living and building a career for themselves, which is great. But Vigdis's brother and father kind of point out that women are still going to be expected to take care of the domestic sphere, right? The childcare, the cleaning, the cooking, all of that home stuff. All of those responsibilities are still going to fall on women, and so women will have kind of double expectations. They'll have to still fulfill their gender role while going out into the world and providing as well. And so Vigdis's family was kind of imagining, well, one of the things that keeps women from being equal to men is that the the traditional woman's job is still the traditional woman's job, and when she goes out into the world, she has to do all of that stuff on top of her career, right? And so that's difficult, right? And the same thing hasn't quite happened for men. Men are still, of course, out there in the public sphere. They're still working careers and making a living, but they haven't been expected to pick up their share of the domestic duties. And we see in sort of a lot of the survey data that, in fact, women do much more housework than men, and home childcare work than men, even in families where both husband and wife have a career and those careers are kind of equally powerful or equally significant. We still see women picking up more of the work at home. So that, of course, will hold them back, right? We heard from Shui Shui from Lesotho, right? And she felt, I think, that some of the more traditional ideas about marriage and family were kind of holding her back, right? There was talk about the sort of I'm not sure if it would be called bride price or dowry. I'm not sure what they would call it in that country, but Shui Shui and her friends were kind of struggling with the idea that they felt like they were being sold, right? Because there was this exchange of cattle between her family and a groom's family in order to sort of formalize the marriage agreement, right? So she felt that, there was perhaps too much family involvement in that decision. She didn't like the exchange of cows. She felt like that was a sale. And whether it was or wasn't probably depends on who you talk to, but I think it's significant for Shui Shui that she feels that way, right? We talked a little bit about, for Shui Shui, we talked a little bit about the burden of kind of the responsibility of sexuality, right? So I suggested the point to you, and you may agree with me or disagree with me based on your experiences, but often responsibility for sexual behavior and sexual health often falls on girls, right? Young boys are kind of encouraged in sort of socialization and media to be the pursuer, the chaser, right? To sort of pursue sexual experiences and pursue women, but women are socialized and taught to kind of be the gatekeepers of that, right? They're the ones who are supposed to say no. They're the ones who have to look after their sexual health, because boys aren't really taught to be concerned about the sexual health of women. Of course, women have an added burden because they have to worry about getting pregnant, which men, of course, don't have to worry about. So we saw this kind of imbalance there as well, in that a lot of the responsibility for men's sexual behavior falls on women a lot of the time, and boys and men are not educated to take equal responsibility for that. One more thing I'll add on that topic is sometimes you'll see that in schools with a dress code, and not in schools where they have uniforms, but where kids just wear whatever they want. You'll often see dress codes where the dress code is more strict and more detailed for young women, and maybe not so much anymore, but in the past the explanation for that was, well, we don't want male students to get distracted, or we don't want male students to get the wrong idea. And that sort of understanding is totally misguided, because again, yes, you want people to be dressed appropriately for school, but on the other hand, boys are responsible for their own attention, right? They're responsible for their own behavior. Women don't have to dress in a certain way in order to make sure that boys behave themselves, right? It's boys' responsibility to behave themselves on their own. It doesn't matter what girls wear or don't wear, right? But again, with that different dress code, you're sending the message that women are responsible for the behavior of men. And if you take that further, you get to a point where, if a sexual assault happens, people start to ask questions about, oh, well, how was she behaving, or what was she wearing, right? And again, none of those questions are relevant, because sexual assault is not okay if a person is wearing a particular item of clothing, right? So again, there is this kind of underlying social message that women are responsible for the sexual behavior of men, right? And that's false. Men are responsible for their own behavior, right? It doesn't matter what girls wear or don't wear. Men have to behave appropriately, right? And also, men have to look after the sexual health of themselves and of their partner, particularly if you are romantically involved and you care about this person. You have to pay attention to that stuff. Good morning, Duong, and good morning Chan. Lulu from the UK. So from her, we heard a number of different things, and a lot of what we heard was really negative sexist comments coming from boys. We heard those two guys in the alleyway talking about porn, and it just happens. You just watch it because it just happens. Whatever. That's not true. But they also speak to that idea of women being responsible for men's behavior, right? Because there was talk about these inappropriate comments, these sexual comments that were made toward girls, talking with girls about sex and porn and things like that, and just kind of being really creepy and uncomfortable. And the two boys in the alleyway say, well, if they didn't want those comments, then don't dress up and don't wear all your makeup if you don't want that attention. And the boys assume that of course women like that attention, and that's why they dress themselves up really pretty. And that again is false, right? Because we know, and I think we established yesterday, women don't just dress up for guys, right? They dress up for themselves. Sometimes girls go out and they dress up for their friends so they can all look pretty and feel good about themselves. Sometimes they want a little bit of male attention, but not from every male, and not in sort of a creepy, gross way, right? So, but again, we saw those guys saying the same thing, that, well, if girls didn't want us to make those comments, then why are they dressing up that way, right? So again, the implication is that it's women's fault, right? Us guys are making gross comments and inappropriate sexist comments, but it's their fault because they look so pretty. No, right? Men are responsible for their own behavior regardless of what women wear or don't wear. And again, women like to dress up and look pretty because it feels good, right? It feels good when you look really nice, right? And sometimes you might want a little bit of interest from another guy, and you might want to look pretty while doing it, but not every guy, right? And you certainly don't want inappropriate comments being made in your direction. So again, we saw that. And then finally we got to Mira from Jordan, right? And so we heard a little bit about Mira's story in terms of the restrictions she has put on her living in her society. The documentary attempted to make a connection between that and religion, because of course Islam is the majority religion in Jordan. I'm not sure if they managed to successfully do that or not, and I'm not sure there was some language in there that I think was vague for me in terms of what Mira was and wasn't allowed to do. And so and I guess I question Mira a little bit because of what A student in the past told me about her experience in Jordan, and I assume that, well, this is true of anywhere. Families are different, right? There's all kinds of different families out there. Some are very conservative and sort of restrictive in terms of what their children can do. Some families are very kind of less restrictive and they just let their kids kind of run wild. There's lots of people in the middle. And so I'm not entirely sure how to interpret what we saw from Mira, but she did tell us the story about how she was, she had less freedoms than her brother, right? She had to follow more rules. Her parents were more concerned about who she hung out with and when. Her dad expressed the importance of him approving of the man that Mira will eventually marry. And again, all of those things are kind of normal, right? Parents want you to marry someone good. They do care about who you hang out with, right? They don't want you hanging out with people who are going to be a bad influence or get you in trouble. I think that goes across cultures, really. So I'm not really entirely sure what we saw from Mira and her family, but I think there probably is a double standard for boys and girls in that country and in that culture, right? Men are allowed to do more things, and if they break the rules, sometimes the rules are a little bit, the punishments are not so severe. And her brother Saad, who was playing basketball, he sort of said, I break the rules all the time, and he didn't seem too worried about it. So again, it's tough to know exactly what we saw there, but there's certainly an inequality within that society as well, because there are really within all societies worldwide. Okay, so that's done. What I asked you to look at this morning was a video on women's suffrage. And so suffrage, I don't know where that word comes from. It's very strange. But suffrage is the right or the ability to vote, okay? And so one of the questions we asked while watching the last video, the BBC video, was what stands in the way of women being equal to men? And so I thought we would dig into this one particular inequality, women's right to vote, to see some of the things that actually were barriers to women being equal in this respect. So women having an equal right to vote, same as men. So we watched the video, right? It was short, it was 7 minutes long or so. And so I wanted to ask you this first question. What was standing in the way of women's right to vote? Because in the US, when the US was founded in the late 1700s, women were not allowed to vote. It was a similar situation in Canada. Women were not allowed to vote in Canada either for quite some time. And our women winning the right to vote in Canada has kind of followed a similar timeline as the US. And so the story you heard in the video was about the US. The story in Canada is broadly similar, okay, and the timeline is similar as well. Okay, so Karen says this. So what stood in the way? Well, first of all, men's pride. Okay. So men didn't. Men saw themselves, I guess, as the ones who were in control, right, of society and of economy and the home, and they were maybe threatened by women sort of adding their voice to the political world, right? I'm going to come back to the rest of that there, Karen. Casey says men thought that women should be governed by their husbands. Oh yeah. And we're not worthy of making tough decisions. Yes. So two things, right, is that the men of the time kind of explained away or dismissed women's desire to vote. They said, oh, don't worry, girls, your husbands represent your interests, right? So just tell your husband what you want, and then he'll take that into consideration when he votes. If men have the right to vote, women should have the right to vote too, right? They're half of the population. Weak argument there. But that's what they said, right? They said that your political interests could be represented by your husband. Just tell your husband what you want. There was also this idea that women were not able to make difficult decisions, right? And so, we still have this kind of stereotypical dichotomy or opposition between men and women, right? And we still see men as more rational and logical and concrete, and we still see women as more emotional. Now, as far as I'm aware, there is a little bit of science to back that up. Men's brains, on average, work in a slightly different way than women's brains do, on average, a little bit. Don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% positive. But socialization plays a big role as well. And we talked about this when we talked about the alien thing, right? Is that men are expected to behave certain ways. They are expected to be less emotional. They are expected to be more rational and logical. And so they are taught to be that way. And so whether or not their brains are working slightly differently, that's how men have been socialized to behave since they're very little. Women have been socialized to be more emotionally expressive, right? They're allowed to express a wider range of emotions. They're allowed to be emotional, particularly if they're upset or sad or frightened. Men often aren't encouraged to do that. And so, it looks like women are more emotional. But again, there's a difference in the socialization process here. But either way, women were seen as kind of illogical, irrational, emotional creatures, and that, they wouldn't be able to make the hard, tough decisions that politics requires. Ridiculous. But anyway, that's what people thought. Cultural background, perhaps, but I need a little more on that one there, Baha. Okay, so then the question is, how did they overcome that? How did they win the right to vote from a bunch of guys who didn't really want to give them that right? How did they win that right to vote? Okay, so Casey says here, women began speaking up to abolish slavery and organized the first women's rights convention, wherein they created the Declaration of Sentiments. Yes. So part of this had to do with speaking out, right? Part of it had to do with using their voice and saying that something was wrong, right? So the first step is to be brave enough to speak out in a society that won't accept what you're saying. And certainly men did not accept what women were saying. But a collection of brave women, some of which we saw in the video there, all did that. They spoke up. They were probably teased and ridiculed and insulted for what they said. Some of them wound up in jail and getting fined and all sorts of things. But the speaking up was important, right? And it was probably difficult for them to do, but they did it anyway. They organized a convention, right? Once they, the video mentions there's a bunch of different suffragist movements, different women's groups who are fighting for this. And eventually they realize that they need to stop working against each other and they need to unite and operate as one force, right? Because they have more leverage and more strength if they're united. So they kind of unite themselves into one group. They hold a convention. They draft a Declaration of Sentiments, right? So this is a document that proposes how American society could be made equal for men and women. That's good. I'm going to go back to Karen here because Karen had women created movement parties and carried out strikes and protests. Yes. So protest is an important part of social change, and we saw that, and we still see it very recently with the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement. Protest is an important aspect of democratic life, right? In sort of real democracies, not like Russia, in real democracies, people have the right to protest, right? That's how you tell the government that you're upset. That's how you tell the government that, you know, what they're doing is not acceptable and they need to make a change, right? The people need a way to express their displeasure to the government, and protest is how they do it. Not looting, not hurting people, not damaging property, but standing out in the streets with signs and yelling and chanting and making a big fuss, right? That's how the population tells the government that something's wrong and that they need to fix it. And so we see that, right? They carry out these parties, they demonstrate, they strike. All of these things are meant to get the attention of society and of the government so that change can be made, right? Mashid says, okay, movement's good, marches, creating an organization, yep, various campaigns, good. Casey, I'm not sure if I didn't catch this one before. Listed with, oh yeah, in the Declaration of Sentiments, that's right, sorry. Listed was protecting women's rights, gender equality, and the right to education and to vote. Yeah, so all of these things were important. And so the woman at the beginning of the video, I forget her name unfortunately, she made the important point that, you know, you don't just get the right to vote, right? You don't, doesn't just happen. You have to fight for it. People don't like to, whoever is in power, people don't like to give that power up. And so you have to fight for it. And it's the same thing. I think the same idea is circulating through societies now in association with systemic racism, is that systemic racism doesn't just go away. It doesn't just happen to be fixed one day. You have to push, you have to fight, you have to demonstrate. And that's kind of what we saw happening a few weeks ago. That's what we still see happening. And if you've been keeping up with the news, you'll see that some change has come, right? There have been positive effects from those protests. Have they fixed the issue entirely? No. But steps have been made in the right direction. And so we'll just have to see what happens with that. Maybe in social justice class in 10 or 15 years, we'll be talking about how that was, you know, that was an important point, or maybe not. We'll see. Okay, that's good. I'm going to take this down. I'm going to go right. So a couple things about the women's suffrage movement that I wanted to point out. So again, women were fighting for the right to vote all the way back into the 1800s in both the US and in Canada. And as we saw, they needed to organize themselves. They needed to create organizations. They needed to band together. They needed to create campaigns and movements and declarations of sentiments and all of those things in order to push their cause forward, in order to get the government and society as a whole to listen to them. But what's kind of interesting and what we should remember about this is that, of course, granting the right to vote, that power was held with men, right? And so, again, women as a minoritized group could not give themselves the right to vote. And the reason why, of course, is because they didn't hold institutional power, right? The government was created by men, it was staffed by men, it was run by men. And so women actually couldn't help themselves in this case. They couldn't use government or the sort of power of the government in order to get what they wanted, because they had no control in the government, right? They had no presence in the government. And so as a result, even though women worked very, very hard to do this and deserve all of the credit, unfortunately, they had to rely on a small number of men who agreed with them. Because again, only men could use this institutional power to give women what they wanted. And of course, at the time, and even coming through to today, men controlled all of the major institutions in society, right? Men controlled the government, the media, the economy, religion, medicine, education, police, the military. It was all under the control of men. And so as a result, men were able to infuse their prejudices and ideas into the fabric of society. And so this is where systemic sexism comes in, is that when one particular group, in this case men, holds all of the institutional power, they are able to create institutions that benefit them, right, and disadvantage others. And so one of those prejudices that we heard about in the video was, again, the idea of what women were like, right? And so women were, not as strong, emotionally strong as men. They weren't as rational or logical. And, their place is in the home, not in the political world, right? That was a prejudice that men held in the past, and some men hold in the present. But of course, it wasn't just politicians that were standing in the way of women's right to vote. There were other social institutions that backed them up, right? And so scientists of the time also agreed that women were inferior and emotional and not cut out for public life, right? So many scientists of the time actually began with the idea that females were inferior to men. And so their research questions were kind of slanted that way. And of course, the way that they interpreted their data was based on that belief as well. And so there was science, not good science at the time, but there was science that suggested that indeed men were the more rational, capable gender, and women kind of, needed to be taken care of because, again, they were, childlike, emotional, irrational beings, right? Ridiculous stuff. Also in the realm of science, psychiatrists also reflected this prejudice because their ideas about mental health and what is normal for humans was based on men. There's a very interesting study, and I wish I had looked it up for today. There's a very interesting study out there where it was actually doctors. Doctors were doing a study about pregnancy hormones. So what's your hormonal state when you are pregnant? But in studying this question, all of the participants in their study were men, which makes no sense. But anyway, psychiatrists viewed the male body and the male physiology as the norm. And so women were different, right? Women were other. Women were slightly less natural because the sort of normal version of a human was seen to be men, right? And so women were disadvantaged from the beginning because certain aspects of women's physiology that is entirely normal were already seen as outside of the norm, because again, the norm was considered to be men, right? And male physiology. Of course, if we took a class at university or school and we heard about history in that period, we would hear all about the history of men, and to some degree we still do. we often didn't hear about women's place in history in school. And so women were, in many ways, assumed to kind of have no history or to have not played any important role in historical events. And again, men had the power to reinforce all of this prejudice throughout society, right? Because, again, they were in control of all of society's institutions. Now, one thing I think I pointed out before during racism when we were talking about white privilege is an aspect of male privilege. The idea that when women are disadvantaged, when women don't have the kind of rights or freedoms or opportunities that men have, that all men benefit from it. And it doesn't matter whether some of those men disagreed, it doesn't matter whether some of those men believe that women should have the right to vote. It doesn't matter, because if you're in the dominant group, you are benefiting from the sort of minoritization, the marginalization of the other groups. And again, you don't have to agree with that, and I'm one of those people. I don't agree with it, but I do benefit from it anyway. Yeah, and so again, oppression is often not personal, right? It is the way that society is constructed. It's the way that society operates as a whole. And so in many cases, what you intend to do and sort of your personal ideas in terms of oppression don't often matter, because again, society is constructed in a certain way and it operates in a certain way. Now, I'm just going to jump out of this. We saw in the video that women, of course, eventually do win the right to vote, right? They are kind of in the early 1900s, they're given the right to vote, in part due to World War I. And so in World War I, lots of Americans and Canadians go off to Europe to fight the war. And so at home, that leaves a lot of empty factory jobs. And so women move into those jobs. They do those factory jobs. They do a great job, just as good, if not better, a job than the men did. And so that gives them a bit of social and economic power. And it also changes people's perception of women as well, right? Because women hop into those factories and they do, a hard day's work, creating bombs and planes and things for the war effort, right? And so as a result of that, and a few other factors that we don't need to get into, the Canadian story on that is a little bit more complicated, but I'll just leave it for now. As a result of that, in part, women start gaining the right to vote kind of in the late 1910s. But as we also saw, that didn't apply to all women, right? That wasn't the end of the fight, because Black women were still not allowed to vote until the 1960s, right? The same can be said here in Canada of Indigenous women. Indigenous women weren't given the right to vote until the 1960s either. So this sort of suffragist movement, this movement of trying to gain the right to vote, was successful ultimately, but it was successful in stages, and some women gained the right to vote earlier than other women, and it had to do with race, right? So this voting suffragist issue had an aspect of intersectionality to it, right? So there were two important identities going on. There was gender, right? The women's right to vote, but there was also race. And so white women were able to achieve the right to vote earlier. Women of color took longer, right? It was a longer fight because there was another set of prejudicial ideas to overcome, right? And of course, with what we see happening around the world today, we know that those ideas still have not been overcome. But even now, when we look at governments in the US and Canada, we still see that women are not equally represented in the political sphere. And so in both Canada and the US, women account for about half of the population. In Canada, they're about 52% of the population. I forget the statistic for the United States, but it's pretty much 50-50, right? So half of the population in both of these countries are women, but if you remember our statistics now, but they are significantly underrepresented in government, right? So again, if you look at the US, and these are 2017 stats, if you look at the US government, the House of Representatives, Congress, and Senate, only 19% of those people are women, right? And so you've probably seen some House of Representative people in the news if you've been watching American news, like Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a few others were mentioned in the video, but they are in a minority in the US government, right? There's still only less than 20% of House and Senate seats belong to women. On the Supreme Court, only 33% of the Supreme Court are women, which actually is not bad because I think there's only 9 Supreme Court justices, and so to have 3 of them as women is still not bad, being in the highest court in the land. Remember, the smaller the sample size is, the harder, the more it will vary, right? So that's not bad. But still, if you look across the US, only 18% of mayors, so the head of the city, only 18% are women. Only 8% of state governors are women. And again, to date, there's never been a female president. Almost, a few years ago, almost, but still not, right? If you look in Canada, we see actually a very similar position. So Canada's 52% of the population are women, and in 2015, Justin Trudeau made the he did something worthy of applause here, where he appointed a 50-50 gender balanced cabinet. And so the if you don't know, the Prime Minister's cabinet are the ministers that will be in charge of all of the major government departments. So we've got infrastructure and finance and fisheries and oceans and agriculture and I don't know, I'm blanking on the rest. There's a lot of them. But his cabinet are the ministers that represent all of those ministries. And so Justin Trudeau made a commitment to appoint half women and half men, which is what he did, which is good. But if you look at the government as a whole, you'll see that only 26% of MPs are members of parliament, so they're federal government representatives. Only 26% of them are women. And so as a result, there's lots of committees that meet that women are not a part of because there's just not enough women to go around. There's not enough women to be on all of these committees. And so lots of committees within the federal government are male dominated because there's just not enough women to go around. And again, you can see here city councilors, so elected representatives to run cities, only 28% of them are women. Only 18% of mayors are women as well. And so here's an interesting statistic for you, that the UN feels that at least 30% of the government needs to be composed of women before governmental policies begin to reflect women's priorities. So the idea here is that if women are to have a meaningful voice in government, you need at least 30% of your government to be women. Less than that, it's not enough. They won't be heard. There's not enough women there to actually affect change. And so you'll see that both in the US and Canada, we fall below that number. We fall below that percentage. And so even though we have women in government in both the US and Canada, according to the UN, we don't have enough women to actually make a difference, right? And so, again, if you look at the stats here, I was pretty surprised when I first saw some of these numbers. In 2017, the U.S. and Canada were number 62 and number 104 in an international ranking of women's representation in government. And some of the countries that show up in the top 10 list are probably not the countries that most Western people would imagine. And so at the time, Rwanda was number one, 61% women. That's not what I would have expected, but congratulations to Rwanda. That's great. You see here some other countries in the top 10: Sweden, Spain, Argentina, Philippines, Algeria, Afghanistan, all rank higher than Canada and the US in terms of women's representation in government. That should shock us here in the US and Canada, because we like to pride ourselves, or we like to imagine ourselves as being pretty close to gender equal. And whether or not that's true, our government doesn't reflect it. So again, even though women are the majority in the US and Canada, they don't hold institutional power. And again, oppression isn't about numbers. It's not about having a numerical majority. Oppression is about who has institutional control, right? Who has institutional power. Okay. We've been working for a long time. Let's take a little break, okay? So take a break, stretch your legs. I'll see you back in here in 10 minutes. I have a few more things to talk about, but I think we'll probably end a little bit early today. I think. But come back in 10 minutes and we'll wrap it up, okay? Okay, people, and we're back. So, this women's suffragist thing illustrates a few things, right? It gives us maybe a few answers to what stands in the way of women being equal to men. One of the questions that came up in that video, in that documentary. But it also demonstrates a few things that we said about oppression in general. We said that oppression was institutional, that it was ideological, that it was historical, and that it was cultural, right? There were those four aspects of oppression. And I'd just like to walk through a couple of those really quickly just to review them. Because we can definitely see them in this example. So, yeah, we said there were four key elements of oppression, that oppression was historical and ideological and institutional and cultural. And so one of the ways in which oppression is historical, at least the way that we continue to see an inequality between men and women in the US and in Canada, women are women are underrepresented in politics, right? Whether it's federal or provincial or municipal politics, women are underrepresented here in Canada and the US. And that has to do with their historical exclusion from the political realm, right? And as a result of that, as a result of being generally excluded, the political system has been created in such a way that privileges men, that advantages men. And so even if we were to have an election tomorrow in Canada or the US or wherever, and even if we were able to elect all women, no men, the problem is they would still have to govern the country in a similar way to the way men do, because the governmental system has been created by men. And so simply electing all women doesn't change everything, right? What has to happen is that we have to elect more women, but we also have to slowly reform the way that government works, right? But again, that's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of pushing, a lot of convincing. And so fixing representation is one thing, right? Trying to encourage more women to step into the political sphere. But even if we achieve perfect equality tomorrow, there's still a lot of work to be done, because again, the government and the laws, for the most part, that we have were created by men, and they advantage men. We also see in this example that oppression is ideological, okay? And so we said ideologies were kind of big shared ideas that a society has about how the world works, or the nature of the universe, or how what humans are. These are really big ideas, and we see them all the time. We see them kind of worked into all kinds of different things. And so because these ideas are kind of everywhere, it seems like they are often true, and it seems like they are just naturally part of the way life is, or the way the world works. And so we've talked about the idea of individualism a little bit, about how everyone is kind of individually responsible for themselves and should take care of themselves, but that's not true because we're all connected. The idea of meritocracy, that people achieve what they achieve based on their own effort and talent, which again is not true. Donald Trump. These are ideologies, right? And so there are ideologies at work in society. And in many cases, they rationalize social inequality. They support it. And so think back to Mean Girls. Why are the jocks and the plastics? Why do they have such high status? Why does everyone respect them so much? Right? Why do people put them on the top of the social hierarchy? There's no laws putting them there. There's no popularity police walking around the school making sure that everyone thinks that the plastics and the jocks are so great. Why does everyone put them up there? Well, because again, oppression is part of our consciousness and socialization. We come to see these kinds of things as normal. And so when we see a high school, like in Mean Girls, where the plastics and the jocks are on top of the social order, we don't really question that because that's usually the way things are, right? That's the natural order of things. Usually the jocks and the, pretty fashionable girls are the most popular kids in school, right? And it doesn't seem to matter that, the plastics are really mean and awful to people around them. They still get a lot of respect and social status because that's just the way things are, right? We just know who's supposed to be popular at school, and those are the kids that are. What else do I want to say here? Yeah, so if we believe that this social hierarchy is natural, it's often difficult to see places where people are unfairly disadvantaged, places where people are equal. And so when the women suffragists were arguing for the right to vote, they had to overcome some of these ideologies because there were ideologies that women were not fit for political office, right? They were too emotional, they were too soft, they were too irrational to participate in the world of politics, and that their place was in the home. But the problem for these suffragettes, these women who are fighting for the right to vote, the problem was not only did men believe that, but a lot of women believed it as well. Many women believed that their place was in the home. Many women felt, no, I don't need the right to vote. I'm not oppressed. I'll just tell my husband and he'll vote the way he votes, right? So lots of women actually had absorbed this ideology as well. And so not only did the suffragettes have to convince men that there was an important social justice issue, there was an inequality that needed to be fixed, but the suffragettes also had to convince some women that there was an issue as well. And so that just shows how powerful these ideologies are, is that the dominant group absorbs the ideology because it justifies their position in society, but even minoritized groups will absorb the ideology as well, which we already know because of Jane Elliott's example with the brown-eyed kids and the blue-eyed kids, right? Ideology was that the blue-eyed kids were not as smart, and they absorbed that ideology anyway, even though it didn't benefit them. Oppression is institutional. So again, government was dominated by men, but all the other institutions were dominated by men as well. And so when women were pushing for the right to vote, they found that these institutions were kind of united against them. So, male politicians didn't really want women voting. Male doctors actually supported that and claimed that women were not strong enough. They didn't have the physical capacity to engage in politics, which is bonkers, but that's what they said. Again, male psychiatrists claimed that women did not have the capacity for rational thought necessary to be able to vote. Yikes, right? That's not right. Male clergy, right? The religious leaders in the community preached that women's place was in the home, right? And that was how God wanted it. That's what God had said. And it's important to note here that, of course, the God was a male God who only spoke to men and who only men could speak for, right? Because only at the time priests could only be men. So religion was united against women. There were male journalists who criticized these women for fighting for the right to vote and sort of engaging in demonstrations and protests. There were male police officers who arrested these women for demonstrating and protesting and for attempting to vote in a presidential election, right? We saw a woman be arrested and fined for that. One woman wound up in jail and was tortured, apparently, which is horrific. But again, the criminal justice system was controlled by men, and so it was used against women who were trying to gain the right to vote. And so, yeah, women were not in the position to use any of society's institutions to advance their cause. And so, even though they fought very hard for this right to vote, what they needed was they needed the help of men. And so they needed a few sympathetic men who would speak out on their behalf or give women space to speak, or simply men who, giving women the right to vote was politically good for them. But either way, this was a situation where women couldn't do it on their own because they didn't have any institutional power. They needed at least a few men to help them out, which fortunately they found. And of course, the last one was oppression is cultural. And so, again, I'm going to go back to my little iceberg diagram here. I never noticed there's a little polar bear sitting on the top. That's kind of cute. The iceberg concept of culture diagram. And so, of course, ideas about what men and women are like and what men and women should do and shouldn't do, what their role in society is, those ideas are fairly deeply held within a culture. And so when they get challenged, people often have a strong reaction to them. I don't think that slide should be there. So yeah, consider how deeply those ideas about men and women are held and how natural they seem to us. When they are challenged, people have a strong reaction. And so you're not just, for women pushing for the right to vote, you're not just pushing against one institution, you're pushing against all the institutions, and you're pushing against ideologies that are circulated in society, and you're pushing against deeply held cultural beliefs, right? You're pushing against all of these things. And so it's a massive fight to be able to change people's minds and get them to a new understanding. But fortunately, women manage to do it. There's also cultural ideas around what politicians should be like. And so you'll see here I've got women who do enter politics are most successful when they are able to demonstrate their ability to fit into the androcentric, the male-centered culture. And so not being overly emotional, caring for their family, but to an appropriate degree, not calling out sexism. These are things that women politicians are expected to do. And I feel like, in part, that was something that hurt Hillary Clinton in the last presidential election. Because Hillary Clinton is a female politician, she has to kind of have a foot in both worlds, right? She has to be sort of confident and powerful enough to convince people that she could be the president, she could be the leader of the nation, right? So she has to model those traditionally male traditionally male characteristics, right? She has to be the commander in chief. She has to be confident and cool and decisive and all of those things. But she's also a woman, right? So she has to show a certain amount of femininity, right, that people will expect from a woman. So she has to be, to a certain degree, she has to be tender and caring and nurturing and loving of her kids. So she kind of has to be both things at once, right? A male candidate doesn't have to do that. A male candidate only has to act like a male politician. right? But again, when we see a female politician, those stereotypical lenses come down, and most of the times we imagine a politician to be white, and usually older, and usually male, right? And so when we see someone else, someone who doesn't fit that stereotypical picture of what a politician is, we see them through a lens of stereotypes. And in the case of Hillary, we see her through a lens of stereotypes about women. And so for Hillary, it's a very difficult balance, right? She's got to try to be sort of masculine enough and confident and cool enough to convince people she can be president, but she also has to be feminine enough to, allow people to believe that she is a woman, which she is. And so Hillary has to kind of, walk the line between these two ideas because of that idea of what a politician is and the idea that politicians are men, that they're male. Male politicians don't have to do that. Male politicians can just be male politicians. And so I think that's one of the things that hurt Hillary Clinton in the last election, is that she had to try to carefully walk this line between masculine traits and feminine traits. And I think sometimes it led people to feel like they didn't know who she was, that she was being fake. And maybe to some degree she was, but she has to kind of be both things at once, right? And that's not easy to do, and she shouldn't have to do it, right? She should simply be able to be a woman politician. But again, because we have an idea of politicians as men and we expect certain things from our political leaders, that's a barrier for Hillary, right? Hillary can't be too feminine and be taken seriously as a presidential candidate. She has to embody some masculine traits. And again, I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I'm just saying that's the way sometimes it plays out in life. Okay, so I know that's a lot, but questions, comments, statements, things you are unclear of, things that you might want to talk about, since we're on the topic of politics and women and voting and things like that. Yeah, questions, concerns, things you want to say, things you want clarity on. Erica says no. Okay. Casey says nope. Nope with an E, with an extra E. Rashid says no. Tika's good. Karen's good. Baja's all clear. Manish is perfecto. No. Is that for questions, or are you singing along with like a song? No, I won't sing. That's bad. Okay, so I'm going to end it there. If I don't see you in comparative cultures very shortly, then I hope you have a lovely weekend. Looks like it's going to be nice and warm and sunny, so try and get outside. Stay socially distanced, but try to get outside and get some fresh air and some sunlight. Monday. Monday is our quiz on classes 29 to 39, so on the sexism stuff. Monday's our quiz. Tuesday, I will give you the assignment for the final paper so you can start working on it, because it's a little bit bigger and a little bit more involved than the little ones have been. But yeah, if that's if that's all, then I will call it there a little bit early. Hopefully that's okay. Don't tell Sarah, she's on vacation, so she'll never know. But that's all I have for you. Monday quiz, Tuesday talking about final research paper, maybe Tuesday a little bit of tying up on the sexism stuff, and then we'll move on to, I think we'll do a little bit on ableism. Yeah, so that's the next few days. So have a nice weekend. Some of you, I'll see you very shortly in comparative cultures. The rest of you, have a good one. Study hard. Quiz on Monday. Have a good weekend. Bye.